Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Kate and I'm a Business Development Manager in the CPD unit at Cardiff University. I'm really delighted to welcome you all to this session today and thank you so much for joining us. We have four academics from the Welsh School of Architecture who are going to share some insights with you today, so it should be a really great session. We have firstly Dr. Hiral Patel, then Emmanouil Perisoglou, Dr. Simon Lannon, and also Professor Chris Tweed. So I'd like to start by introducing Hiral. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to our session. We are delighted to be here sharing our research on building performance with you. I will start sharing my screen so that I hope you all can see it properly. I just want to say a brief note on building performance because if we have international audience, probably it might be useful to kind of say a few sentences on what we mean by building performance. Building performance approach is a way of thinking about buildings from when we design buildings to how we use them and then adapt them for reuse. It's thinking about the performance aspects from the very beginning. So performance can be thought of in terms of energy use, how users feel in the building, user satisfaction, thermal comfort, or it can be about user practices. And we are going to touch upon some of these aspects throughout our session today. Building performance evaluation is often kind of thought of simultaneously along with post-occupancy evaluation. And post-occupancy evaluation is a process that we conduct after a building has just been completed. There is a series of evaluation kind of processes that we undertake to see how a building is performing in terms of various aspects. There are various techniques out there in terms of post-occupancy evaluation and building performance. However, there are some issues, conceptual issues with some of the techniques, and that's where I would like to start. One of the issues around the approaches to building performance evaluation are to do with how we think about buildings themselves, and that is to do with two ideas. One of determinism, environmental determinism. So in that case, we exaggerate the influence of physical environment too much, and we kind of think about people as passive and don't really take into account the agency that people have. And that is also linked with the aspect that physical environment is often thought about in terms of a fixed entity, and it's not thought about as something which evolves over time. So the idea that the performance also evolves over time is something that we probably need to think about when we are doing building performance evaluations. We have a kind of, so these four ideas here are from Karen Frank in 1984, and some of those resonate even in today's kind of approach to building performance evaluation. And there is a reference here at the bottom of the screen from a recent paper that I have published with Professor Stuart Green, where we talk about these issues in current kind of research environment. So what I propose as an idea is that we probably need a conceptual shift in terms of how we think about buildings, and then probably reframe what we mean by building performance. So my doctoral studies were kind of looking at the library building at the University of Reading, which is a 50-year-old library building. It was built in 1960s, and you can see from the photographs here that from the outside, it appears that the building hasn't changed much, but over the course of 50 years, there has been a range of different interventions at varying scales. So some have been deep retrofits of, say, electrical cabling, and some of them have been quite minor IT upgrades. But the building has changed so much that how we think about performance would have also changed from, say, 1960s to now. And what I found is that what we mean by library is quite different. So it can be a bookstore, it can be a space for students to study, it can be a cafe for people to meet up, it's a place where staff work, it's a place where during open days there are exhibitions created so that visitors are kind of introduced to the university as a whole. So it's like a landmark in the open day itinerary. So we can see that the building here is not fixed, but it is continuously changing and evolving in this kind of practices of using the building. And this is the main conceptual shift which I want to propose in the context of building performance evaluation. So maybe going forward, we probably need to think about what are the underlying assumptions of the methods that they are using to assess building performance. So if I take the example of the library further, the library, hold on, the library had 750 seats when it was opened first, and the student population was just 5,000 seats. Over years, the student population has grown drastically, and the number of seats hasn't increased in that proportion. But there are various technological advances which have made it possible for this amount of seats to still cater a wide range of students. So being able to access the resources online, I think, is one of them. However, occupancy is a big matter of concern for libraries and for many buildings like office buildings. So during my field work, I used 4 methods to kind of study the occupancy of the library building. One of them is sweeping survey. So what I did was I went around the building 4 times a day for a week, making an observation of which seats in the building are occupied on the floor plan. The second one is a published study by Professor Li Shao and his colleague. They used Wi-Fi-based detection technique to kind of explore occupancy patterns in a given space in the library, and I'll talk about that a bit more. The third method is shadowing, so it's observing closely the students, what they're doing, and I shadowed 4 students, so I kind of went with them in the building and kind of sat next to them and kind of made notes of what they're doing and interviewed them. The fourth technique I won't be talking about here today, but was about using archival questionnaire. So there was a student survey from 1969, which kind of showed the occupancy patterns that were kind of existing at that time. But you can find more information in this reference below. So occupancy, this is a screenshot from the sweeping survey method. So you can see that the blue dots are where males were sitting. I was just curious to see if there were any patterns in terms of gender. And the red dots were where females were sitting. And this helped me to kind of map which seats within a building, within the library building, were popular at what particular time. And putting that data and kind of doing analysis on that, I came up with this kind of visualization where you can see that the green, so the 4 columns here are the 4 kind of times during the day. So morning, afternoon, evening, and late in the evening. And the green kind of cells highlight when the seats were fully occupied. Say the occupancy ratio was almost close to 1. And the orange color cells show that the occupancy was less than 0.25. So the seats were not occupied. And you can see that there were some seats which were not popular throughout the day. So that was the finding from that method. The Wi-Fi based technique was used in one particular area. So the sweeping survey was done throughout the building. However, the Wi-Fi detection is in one particular area, as you can see on the left-hand side here. And the nodes were placed to create a kind of a network. And if you enter the space with a Wi-Fi enabled device, it would record your presence, and it would record the duration of the presence there. And 4 patterns were kind of found out from this technique. So one pattern was somebody just coming in and leaving very quickly. So if they are looking for someone, for instance, and they couldn't find that person there. The other pattern was pattern B, which is somebody staying there for, say, half an hour to 1 hour to do some task or do some like a concentrated piece of work. Pattern C is the same person kind of entering the space at different times of the day, but for a very short duration. And that could be somebody like a member of staff who's just there for invigilating if everything is okay. And pattern D is for intense users who are there in the space for 1 to 2 hours, and then they just go out for a short break and then return back. So this method kind of detected the occupancy based on the presence. And this is an excerpt from shadowing method. So here I was shadowing 2 library users, and I'll just read the quote, which is from my notes. So the 2 users began working. User 1 reads notes on user 2's laptop. User 2 goes to get some prints. User 1 then gets up and goes somewhere else while the laptop, this is happening while the laptop is still there on the desk where I'm sitting. And user 1 comes back and looks at the prints. User 2 goes down to buy a snack. He returns in 5 minutes. User 1 stands up. He wants to see if he can get a book. So the laptop has been sitting there for quite some time while the users are just living, going and coming back turn by turn. So this will have an effect in terms of if we were monitoring the occupancy based on the Wi-Fi, on the presence of a Wi-Fi device. So what is at stake when we are thinking about methods for building performance evaluation? And here I want to draw the idea of ontological politics from Emmanouil, where she's saying that the methods have a kind of a role to play in how we frame the research object. So by using the 4 methods, we are framing the buildings quite differently. So in sweeping survey, the building occupancy and the building is framed in terms of the number of seats. And in Wi-Fi detection method, the kind of space is framed in terms of the location of the node, and the seats are not even featured in that case. It's the presence of the Wi-Fi enabled device. And it has also implications in how we are framing users. So in Wi-Fi detection method, the users are framed through the proxy of Wi-Fi enabled device. However, in sleeping survey, the users are framed as those who are occupying the seats, and those moving are not considered, which would otherwise be picked up by the Wi-Fi detection method. So you can see here that the method we use has an implication on what is being studied and what is being measured. So I want to kind of summarize this through these 3 points. The methods are not innocent procedures. They have an active role in how we frame our reality, how we frame what a building is, how we frame what a user is, and hence they are political. So we need to be reflective in terms of which method we are using. And I think some of the points that Manos will talk about next will kind of touch on this. And I want to leave with this idea of streetlight effect. So here a boy has lost his keys, and the keys are somewhere in the dark in the gutter, and he's looking for it where there is this light coming from the street lamp. So taking this analogy, I think we probably need to, we can often get distracted with where we can find data and kind of forget what is the real question that we are trying to address. And I think that is the most important thing that we probably need to reflect on. So I'll hand over to Manos next, and I'll stop sharing my screen. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Hiral. I'll try to share my screen. All right, guess we need a couple of seconds to load. So my name is Emmanouil Perisoglou. I'm a research associate in Cardiff University in the Welsh School of Architecture, and I'm involved in the LCD project, the Low Carbon Built Environment project, with the purpose to retrofit and to show the markets and the housing associations how to retrofit buildings. And I'm going to talk about more technical aspects of building performance evaluation. I'm going to explore and to show our workflow and how we evaluate buildings. And I'm going to talk a little bit about teaching as well. How do we incorporate building performance evaluation in teaching in the school? So when we start by the word evaluation is by all the phrase that describes a change. So in order to assess a change, we need somehow to quantify. So to compare status A to status B, or status B with like a frame, a benchmark, or like a model. So the key tool there is monitoring. So we monitor the difference between 2 points in time. So I'm going to explore workflows on monitoring as well. Okay. So why we monitor in the technical side of the building performance in the building world, we monitor by default in all the control systems. So when we have a system, a building service, this needs some data in order to operate. So we need measurements there. The same with commissioning. When you commission, let's say, a ventilation system, you need to adjust the flow to make sure that the appropriate delivery is there, and to make sure that the warranties are checked and the system performs. Similarly with the energy schemes, in order for, let's say, the government to pay some money back to you, you need to make sure that you know how much for example, you generate from a PV. And nowadays it's quite popular to monitor values for public awareness. And this has worked with occupants as well, and in our project, where we monitor, for example, the PV generation, and occupants are enthusiastic, and they try to match their demand with the sun and use their appliances when the PV would generate, and the electricity would be for free. In the research context, we monitor in order to quantify a change. So that change could be to identify the gap between the real world and the modeled work. And in order to visualize this better, this is a workflow we use in the LCD project in order to retrofit, but we've done some new builds as well. So at first, we get some initial data. For a new build, this could be site analysis or the context of design. And this will inform our modeling. And then the modeling will optimize the design. And then we need all the special contractors, we need to procure the materials in order to move to the construction. And then when the building is done, we monitor the building to evaluate the performance, as Hiral mentioned. So there are two steps there. You can quantify, you can describe a change between real and model. So a benchmark or a modeling exercise and a post-occupancy exercise. So you can compare the performance gap, as we call it. And this can be the case in both new builds and retrofits. Or the other step is to have an existing situation, let's say a pre-retrofit situation, and you monitor the pre-retrofit status, and then you monitor the post-retrofit. And so you can quantify the change before and after. Before we analyze the workflow, I think it's quite crucial to point out who is interested in performance evaluation, and especially in monitoring, in quantifying methods. And that's an overview of different perspectives of stakeholders with some examples. So it's crucial to know who do communicate quantified data, because they all have different perspectives. For example, the owners, they are mostly interested in if this is this like change cost effective. So for example, if you apply this new innovative system, is it cost effective? What is the operational cost? What is the cost value in it? Whereas like governments and policymakers are more interested in the reduction of carbon emission and how the market will be boosted. And or insurers, for example, it's all about risk. So they need to know about warranty. So the target or the performance indicator of the reasoning behind the performance evaluation is different. So as a first step is very helpful to identify who we refer to and what is the reason of evaluating, of describing a change, let's call it. So this is a workflow we use in the LCP project, and I use it for teaching purposes as well. So the first question is why, and it has to do with who is the stakeholder and what is the purpose of evaluating. And then that's a technical term. What do we monitor? So what is the quantity? What is the change we want to monitor, specific change? And we call them performance indicators. And then there is a next step is how. And the very first step after establishing the performance indicator is to find the right equations and find the right way to describe it. And then you need to use the appropriate instrumentation, and you need to go there and install. And in the COVID era, that's difficult, and we will discuss about this. And then you need to make the best of the existing data, EPCs, if it's a retrofit, or questionnaires, or Hiral mentioned, or weather data, in order to be able to normalize before and after status. And then you analyze the data and you consider all the errors, and you create outputs in order to respond to the why and what of this workflow. In order to make it more simple, I'll run exactly the same workflow for, let's say, a retrofit example, that you have a PV and a new door and windows and LED lights in a retrofit process in an electric heated house. So the why would be, what is the contribution of these interventions, and the what would be, what is the cost, operational cost reduction, CO2 reduction, and the energy reduction. Let's assume that these are the performance indicators. And then you apply the appropriate mathematical tools and appropriate instrumentation, and you convert and you translate this into sensors, more or less. And you use occupancy data to make sure that before and after is comparable. And then you tackle and you trace the errors, you try to normalize values, and you create outputs that will respond to the why and what. So that's a potential output. You can see here the reduction in terms of cost, and in terms of energy percentage, and in terms of CO2 emissions. So that's my last slide, and that's the workflow, the monitoring workflow. And I'm going to talk a little bit of how we use this in the school. And well, the first great thing about Welsh School of Architecture and Building Performance Evaluators is that we are involved in a lot of projects with a variety of stakeholders. And the stakeholders could be policymakers, clients, housing associations, so a variety of the building community, let's say. The other thing that I'd like to point out is that, for example, in LCP project, we are 9 members there, and we have building physicists, electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, environmental science. We have 3 architects, So, and we all teach. So all the teaching is research that teaching. And in the environmental, in the monitoring lab, we have more than 1,000 sensors ready to be used by the students as well. And we monitor probably more than 50 buildings at the moment. And only in the LCP project, we are monitoring 35 of them. And in the COVID era, it's quite difficult to go there and collect data. So we have at the moment 2 servers in the schools with a time interval of 5 minutes, the best. Simon can talk a little bit about that. And we have the students have access to some of the data, especially in their dissertations. And of course, we have all the libraries and the benchmark to support the evidence. And we have a wide range of publicities and impact case studies. And these impact case studies, they are not only like research targets where we just tick a box. They are impact case studies about poverty. So we work very close with housing association, and we try to tackle the today's questions and issues. All right, thank you very much for that. I'll pass this to Simon now. I'm gonna stop sharing.
Okay, thanks very much, Manos. And sort of leading on from that, I think it'd be really useful to show a case study of some work we've been doing. So hopefully you can see this off-grid dwelling in South Wales. It doesn't look like a typical building within South Wales, but it's a very interesting building. It was sort of a fully off-grid 3-bed house, farmhouse, self-built, and it was designed by BRE. Now this project is quite interesting because it was about the farmer wanting to go back to his land and make sure that they could look after their animals. He had been attempting, or the family had been attempting to go back for many years, and it was only when the whole big team was brought together that they could actually manage to get back up there. So they got the building built. They self-built, having contractors in. They had help from utility and also some of the local council, the regional development partnership. And they sort of got together and built this lovely building. One of the things is it became very complicated, and it's very complicated to do an off-grid building. So there's no connections to the water main, gas main, electricity, or telephones. So what they had to do is they had to install all the systems. So they put in all the kit you'd expect. So they had a generation, so that's a PV system. They had a storage system for electricity, that's a battery bank, a diesel generator for backup, very useful within a farm because they use diesel tractors and various other equipment. They got their heat from a biomass boiler, which is fed from a local woodland, so they didn't have to go far to get the wood. That was then a slightly oversized boiler because, of course, a boiler they usually are for large buildings. This is only a small building and built well, so it didn't need much energy for heating. So what they decided to use was a thermal store to allow sort of the temperature to be, the boiler to work efficiently. Also with that, I mentioned there's no water connection, so they had to do rainwater harvesting. And they also took water from the adjacent barns, and they had a water tank in the basement. One of the interesting things about this is that the pictures you can see on the screen on the left of is the building itself, and in the middle and on the right is the plant room, which was quite a large room, and this caused controversy within the planning authority because it was seen as an additional space within the building that wasn't in the original sort of floor area. But after a while, all the team got together and managed to convince the planners that that was okay, and this wasn't an occupied space, and it was a requirement for all the services to be built in. So the questions, when we were asked to join after the building, sort of about 9 months after the building had been completed. And I think the owners and all the stakeholders really wanted to understand 3 questions. One was the energy supply, how is that working? And how did it go against benchmarks? Water usage, again, that was quite an unusual part of this aspect of this building, is that the water was off grid. And then also, how did the occupants adapt? And that was kind of those 3 things. So how do we answer that? Well, we do the simple energy metering for the energy supply, energy and water metering and also occupant introduced for the water usage. And then again, behavioural study looking at how the occupants adapt. So going on to the energy supply, this is a sort of a simple graph of the supply from the July to the September. And what you'll see is the green is the PV generation, the red, or the darker red is the diesel generation for the winter, and the blue is this appliances, this house level. And what became clear is that this house level should easily be met by the PV all throughout the year, but why was the diesel generation coming on? And this is a sort of sample of a few days within February. Again, the diesel is the darker red, and then you have the purple is the battery voltage as it drops away, and the PV generation and the appliances are lower down. What this shows is that you have 3 or 4 days, 2 days of really good generation from the PV, and then the battery trails off, and then the diesel generator has to kick in to boost the battery back up. Again, the levels of the blue and the green, the small levels of appliance and PV, weren't really showing us why we needed to have a diesel generation. And what became clear once we did some extra monitoring was that the services in the building, all these things we had to put in, or they had to put in to actually service the house, were taking a lot of electricity. So in this particular slide, you can see that, so the house itself, that's the people, that's the sockets, the kitchen, the lights, and you consider what will be a people orientated. It's got about 2 kilowatt hours per day. And the services in the basement were nearly 6 times that size, or over 5 times. And what's fascinating about that is you have the boiler using quite a lot of electricity, the basement lights not too bad, the water purifier using quite a lot, and the immersion heater using a lot as well. The immersion heater was the occupant actually taking PV generation and directing it into the immersion, into the hot water tank. So that's kind of user orientated. But again, this basement sockets, which is very high, and that was because they're a farmer. They had a large freezer in the area, and that was where they stored some of their produce. So they couldn't really avoid these things. So that kind of led on to the water usage. The water usage, you could see there was a target of about 100 litres, 101 litres per person. They really worked very hard as a family, and they got it down to 66, which is way below the level. Now, they didn't smell, they were lovely people, and they did plenty of washing, but they made sure they worked with their water supply. Now, water supply, you think it rains a lot in Wales. It does, but it doesn't rain all the time. So the rainfall is the yellow, and that shows that there are particular periods within the year that have very little rain. And this caused quite a lot of anxiety to the householders, because they had to go and get water. So they would go off and actually get water from neighbours in large containers, about a cubic metre at a time. Another thing about the water is of course, all the processing has to be done on site. And so this is using some of the fine detail data. And what we found is that if you compare the consumption per litre of the house itself, which is about 8.5 watt hours per litre, compared to the national supply, which is 0.6, it uses a significantly larger proportion. So the idea that rainwater harvesting is good, it is true. It's very good for the environment, but it does have an electrical cost, and we have to be careful that we consider that when we're doing both. So finally, going on to behavioural study. Now, this is quite interesting. These people are living a very different life. They are off-grid, but they are what I consider they felt that they weren't having to adapt very much. They didn't feel that they were taking any particular routines. They didn't really compromise or habits. But what they did do is they did adjustments. They adjusted to the weather. They looked at the weather, and they saw the weather as their friend in a sense. They could, when it was sunny, they would know that they could use their electrical appliances like the immersion heater, doing some ironing, and they felt that it was really important that we can't do this, but they actually had a good team with them, and they took them through that process, which is very important, that they actually had advisors and professionals to help them with this process. They were very happy with their electrical systems. They understood the PV, they understood the solar, the actual storage systems. They were very happy with all of that, and they knew that the diesel was there to back them up. What was really concerning was the water. They were very surprised by how much water they were using, and how an impact that had on their lifestyle. So that it was quite an interesting process of adaptation. So in summary, they did very well in terms of their consumption against benchmarks. They hadn't realised how much the services were taking from their system, in particular the water purification. They understood that they had to be careful with water, but overall they were incredibly happy with the house. And we helped them to think about how they might use their building differently, sort of looking after their building, their batteries, but also how they may consider to deal with their water supply. So I think at that point, I will pass over to Chris to continue.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I hope you're all keeping well in these strange times. Thank you for joining us for the webinar. My name is Chris Tweed. I'm the head of the Welsh School of Architecture and Professor of Sustainable Design. And I'm going to conclude the presentation about building performance today. So what I'm going to talk about is, firstly, the evolution of approaches to building performance. Now, you've already heard from my colleagues about the social aspects of building performance, and Manus has talked about a very technical approach to that, and Simon, to some extent, has brought that together in a particular case study. I'd like to revisit some of those areas and just talk maybe slightly more generally about how the subject of building performance has evolved over many years. And then I'm going to say a few words about the ideas of how building performance might develop and where it will go in the future. Most of what I'll say will refer to thermal comfort, but much of it applies to other aspects such as indoor air quality, acoustics, and the visual and lighting environment. So to begin with, to revisit, I guess, what Manus was talking about, the physical sciences, the investigations of environmental conditions begin really with studies of how human beings could survive and tolerate extreme thermal conditions. Scientists carried out many laboratory-based experiments on human subjects by exposing them to some very extreme conditions to understand how they might survive in those conditions in harsh climates. So the roots of building performance lie in the physical sciences, and that today consists mainly of the monitoring of actual buildings and the modeling using computer models to predict how buildings might perform under a range of different conditions. And this is very valuable work, and it underpins most of what we know about how thermal environments meet the expectations of people. And you'll see, I've seen examples of that in both what Manus and Simon have talked about earlier. So a lot of that work started with physiological studies of how the human body both generates and copes with different thermal environments, and how that the mechanisms that it has, the homeostasis, works at a physiological level. So that's kind of where the physical sciences took us. It provides us with an understanding of the performance of indoor environments, and is focused on a relatively narrow set of variables, and therefore excludes some important aspects of how people use buildings. So to sum up, the kind of physical sciences approach is that the world consists of identifiable objects with well-defined properties. It treats people as passive actors who contribute mainly to the generation of heat, sound, and odors to spaces. And people are described mainly as physiological processes. However, researchers began to see that the social sciences could add a new dimension, a new type of understanding to building performance studies. And Hiral has mentioned some of the work that she carried out on her PhD, and the social sciences in general in relation to building performance focus on, as you might expect, people and the social practices that they engage in using space and the systems within buildings. One of the big differences, I guess, with socially oriented approaches to buildings is that they tend to look at buildings in actual use rather than in a laboratory setting. So in contrast to those laboratory settings, these kinds of studies are much more rewarding, but they're also a lot more challenging for the researchers themselves. And it involves, of course, working with multiple subjects rather than individuals in laboratories. Some further points that I'd like to emphasize about the social science approach is that it recognizes that people are actively engaged with the built environment. They're interacting with it. And that in doing so, they are free agents in that they can act pretty much as they choose within certain cultural constraints. But their attitudes and behavior are socially conditioned and as members of a cultural group. And that their activities may also be shaped by the social practices and shaped by cultural norms. So nowadays you'll find that most studies of building performance, including the one that Simon has just talked about, they combine the physical and the social in some ways. However, I think there's still a gap in our understanding of what people expect from their environments. And that for me is the definition of performance. What it is that people expect from their environments, and how can we assess that, and how can we create better environments? So I want to show you a very brief example from some work we did on occupant behavior in housing. For the architects among you, you might want to avert your eyes because this is not particularly pretty architecture, but it illustrates the point quite clearly. This is a householder that we interviewed in her conservatory, which has been added onto her property, probably without the involvement of any architect, as you might guess from the aesthetic. And the point I want to make here is that this householder enjoyed being in this space so much, presumably because of the view that she had of her garden, that she adapted it so that she could use it throughout the year. So she put in a fan, which allowed her to stay cool during the summer, but of course increases the amount of energy that's being used in her dwelling. And then to make sure she could use it in the winter, she added a portable gas heater, which for many of us, we cringe at the thought of that because not only does it consume more energy, but it adds a lot of moisture to the environment, which creates some very uncomfortable conditions. I suppose my point here is that the use of this conservatory lies outside our normal consideration of performance, in that the householder is not particularly focused on energy and is not particularly focused on maintaining what you would call ideal comfort conditions, but is so enthused by using this space that she felt the need to adapt the environment accordingly. So that's, I think, is a clear example of an element of performance that sits outside both the physical and social spheres. And we could argue that, that what's being glimpsed at there is some element of aesthetic appreciation of the garden, whatever, that has changed the way this householder decided to use her home. So my point, I guess, is that the future, just as building performance evaluation has broadened over the past 50 years, I think it's probably going to broaden further. And I would argue that the real interest in holistic perspective of building performance lies at the intersection of these three disciplines: the physical sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities. And that points us towards what we would call in architecture lived experience, which suggests that we develop a phenomenology of environments. And that is a deeper, something that develops a deeper understanding of the experience that people have in actual buildings, beyond simply asking questionnaire questions, but actually analyzing how they experience the phenomena within a particular building. If you want some examples, I can give you some more examples of where the thermal experience, if you like, is more important to people than their comfort. Here's an extreme case, the Ice Hotel, which is built every year in northern Sweden when there's sufficient ice, where the bedroom temperatures go down to -6, and yet people from all over the world will spend a lot of money actually going to stay in the Ice Hotel because of the experience it gives them. Now, clearly that's an extreme example, but there are ones that are more familiar to us in the everyday settings. And we get everyday reminders of the delight that people gain from particular thermal environments. This is talked about in architecture, but it rarely makes the translation into building performance evaluation. However, if you imagine changing that point source of heat there, the open fire, for something else, it significantly alters the experience of those within that space. So my concluding remarks are that each of the paradigms that I've talked about of building performance evaluation, they offer a different explanatory power, and they give us different insights into how people perceive, behave, and interact with the designed world. But it is a holistic definition, I think, of building performance that offers us new opportunities for designing environments that will enrich people's lives rather than simply ensuring that they survive and are comfortable. That's the end of my main presentation, but I just wanted to unashamedly promote one of our programs, which goes into a lot more detail on the issues that we've been talking about today. That's our MSc in Advanced Building Performance Evaluation, which very much takes on board this broader interpretation of building performance and has a number of modules that cover different aspects of the interpretation of performance. So I'll return to our host, Hiral, and we're happy to take any questions you might have following the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Manos and Simon, for sharing your insights. I've been monitoring the Q&A, and I think you all have been responding to it as we went along. I think there is a question probably for Chris. I don't know whether you want to say something on AI, because I've been seeing there's been some active discussion around that topic. So if Chris wants to kind of summarize that for broader audience.
Yeah, there's been I've been discussing the development of AI with Christopher Christie, who's put forward some very interesting views. We could spend a lot longer on this, yeah, I mean, one of the things I suppose with AI is it's made huge progress in the past couple of decades, since I was actively involved in it some years ago. And the touchstone at that time was Hubert Dreyfus's philosophical treatise on what computers can't do. And I see that Christopher has replied, labeling that as ancient. My only defense is that we still read Plato and Socrates, and they are considerably older and have some very interesting points to make. But I think this is a debate that we need to have. And in fact, we are doing research on what happens in buildings when you start to take the agency away from human users and incorporate it or embed it in AI systems, as is often promoted within some of the smart and intelligent buildings programs. So I don't have any immediate ready answers to this, because it is an ongoing debate, and that's exactly how it should be. I think it's really important that we have all sorts of views heard on this. My main concern, I guess, is when I look at the description of smart buildings, particularly where they refer to environmental controls, is I never see any critiques. I never see anything, or rarely see anything negative said about them. I think that's a characteristic of a lot of research that goes on now. Certainly when I was working in AI some years ago, we used to build systems and then tear them apart to say what was wrong with them. But now I guess that would be career suicide if you build a system and then told everybody what was wrong with it. So there's an ongoing debate, I think, which needs to be had there.
I'd like to bring a very quick example. Well, my first degree is automation engineer, so I'm really a lover of AI systems. However, we refurbished 6 buildings, bungalows buildings with Swansea Council, and one of them, heavy health issues. We included a ground source heat pump, Tesla batteries, photovoltaic panels, MVHR systems, all the nice package there. And the house used to have oil boilers, really old boilers with radiators that could heat up to 65 degrees. And with the new system, the ground source heat pump, this is a low gradient system, so the radiator would heat up to 40 degrees for 24/7 though. So the temperature there was extremely stable, and it was 2 degrees higher average if you compare with the pre-evaluation state. So the comfort was great. And then we had the occupant saying, the heat doesn't work. And we said, well, we have all the data here, and you have a very stable, comfortable environment, 22 degrees, like 2 degrees above the regulations and the guidance and so on. And you have a very clever system as well, with everything is automated. And she said, well, when I don't get the pleasure from my radiator, I used to be very close to the radiator and get the warmth of the radiator. And now it's almost cold. So what I'm trying to say here is that pleasure is another parameter, and variability in terms of comfort is a so complicated issue that is very difficult to tackle with conventional AI systems. So we need to, I'm an engineer, so my initial thinking is apply all the super automation. However, there are complicated issues that we need to tackle as well.
And before we close the session, I just want to add one more thing, which I have mentioned, is the agency of users. And I know that in library that I studied, the stacks had PIR sensors. So if they are browsing a book near the stacks, the lights would go off, and the users don't have the agency to so they have to wait to turn the lights on. So I think that there is an element of feeding in the user practices back into how we design the automation system. So the idea of the small data and not to let things black box, I think is important. So I think we are running out of time, so I'll hand over back to Kate.
Thank you very much. Yes, unfortunately, we are running out of time because it's a fascinating topic and lots of interesting discussion there. But thank you so much, Chris and Hiral, Manos and Simon. Thank you for today, and everyone for joining us. And we're going to sign off now. Thank you. Bye-bye.